She had always loved the small diner on the corner of her street. It was the kind of place where the coffee smelled like home, and the regulars smiled at you as if you were part of their little world. Every week she would slip away from her busy day and take a quiet lunch there. It was her small escape, a place where she could relax and enjoy a moment to herself, away from the endless responsibilities that filled her life. Today, like most days, she walked through the familiar door and was greeted by the warmth of the diner's old wooden booths and the hum of friendly chatter. The smell of pancakes and sizzling bacon filled the air, and she smiled, feeling a small comfort wash over her. She had chosen a booth by the window, her favorite spot, where she could watch the world outside while sipping her coffee. As she settled in, she waved to the waitress, who always remembered her order. There was something soothing about routines, about knowing that in this tiny part of the world things were predictable and calm. But today, that calm was about to be shattered. She noticed the man the moment he walked in. He was dressed in uniform, a cop by the look of his badge, but there was something in his stride that made her uneasy. He carried himself with an air of arrogance, and his eyes scanned the diner as though he owned the place. He was the kind of man who demanded attention without asking for it, who expected everyone to follow his rules, even if those rules did not make sense. She tried to ignore him at first, focusing on her coffee and the small notebook she liked to carry to jot down her thoughts. But it was impossible to ignore the way he approached her booth. He stopped just short of her table, leaning slightly with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. She looked up at him, her heart sinking a little. "Can I help you?" she asked politely, trying to keep her tone neutral. She had learned long ago that staying calm was often the best defense when facing someone who seemed intent on causing trouble. The man's voice was sharp and condescending. He began questioning her presence in the diner, implying that she didn't belong there, that she was out of place. She felt her cheeks flush, a mix of anger and disbelief rising within her. She had never been confronted like this before, at least not so blatantly. She tried to maintain her composure, answering calmly, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her intimidated. Around them, the diner carried on, though she could feel the eyes of a few patrons on them. Some pretended not to notice, sipping their coffee and eating their lunches as if nothing were happening. Others, she realized, were watching closely, sensing the tension in the air. She could feel the weight of their stares, the silent judgment of those who understood, and it gave her a small measure of strength. She straightened in her seat, her hands resting firmly on the table. The officer's tone grew sharper, his words more biting. He started making remarks about her, about how she should conduct herself, about how people like her behaved. Each word was designed to provoke, to assert power where he had none over her. She could see it clearly now. This was not about her actions, not about any rule she had broken. This was about him, about his need to feel superior, about a prejudice he carried that had no place in the diner or in her life. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She refused to let him see her fear. She knew that if she reacted with anger or tears, it would only fuel his arrogance. She had faced discrimination before, though never so openly, and each time she had learned to respond with dignity and calm strength. This was no different. She looked him directly in the eyes and spoke firmly, her voice steady. "I am here to have my lunch just like anyone else. I have done nothing to deserve your treatment." He scoffed at her words, dismissing them with a wave of his hand, but she could see the slight hesitation in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty that reminded her that he was human, flawed, and capable of being held accountable. She didn't know how the situation would end, but she refused to be the victim in this moment. She stayed seated, refusing to move or react with fear, letting her calm confidence speak louder than any words she could say. The waitress approached carefully, sensing the growing tension. She placed a plate of food in front of the woman, her eyes darting nervously between the two of them. "Is everything okay here?" she asked softly. The woman nodded, grateful for the quiet support even if it was small. "Yes, thank you," she replied, keeping her attention on her food, her notebook, and the man who continued to stand nearby, seemingly unsure how to proceed. The diner, usually a place of comfort and routine, now felt like a stage where a confrontation was unfolding, yet she remained composed. She knew that how she carried herself in this moment mattered more than any argument. She focused on her breathing, on the small comforts around her, the smell of coffee, the warm sunlight through the window, the gentle hum of the diner, and reminded herself that she was not alone. She had faced challenges before, and she would face this one with the same quiet strength. As the officer lingered, she realized he was losing the upper hand. Her calm refusal to be intimidated was disarming him. She could see it in the slight twitch of his jaw, in the way his words faltered before he spoke. For all his bluster and arrogance, he was struggling against the dignity she radiated. It was a small victory, though the larger battle was yet to come. In her mind, she began to plan the next steps. She would not leave this encounter unresolved. She would find a way to ensure that such behavior was addressed, not just for her, but for anyone who might face similar treatment in the future. Her determination grew stronger with each passing moment, fueled by a sense of justice and the knowledge that courage often came in quiet, steadfast acts. The officer finally stepped back, muttering something under his breath. She stayed seated, refusing to react, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered or upset. Around them, life in the diner slowly returned to normal, though the tension lingered like a shadow in the corners of the room. She ate her lunch calmly, every bite a small act of defiance, a statement that she would not be silenced or humiliated. By the time she left the diner, she felt a mixture of relief and resolve. The encounter had shaken her, yes, but it had also reminded her of her strength. She walked back to her car with her head held high, aware that this was only the beginning of addressing a deeper issue. She had faced prejudice head-on today, and she had done so with grace. That alone was a victory. And in the quiet of her car, she allowed herself a small, private smile. She knew that change was coming, that accountability was possible, and that she had the power to stand up not just for herself, but for the dignity of everyone around her. Today had been difficult, but it had also been a moment of affirmation, a moment that reminded her of the strength that had always been within her, waiting to rise to the occasion. After leaving the diner, she felt a mixture of frustration and determination. The encounter had left a bitter taste, but it had also reminded her of something important. She would not let someone else's ignorance or hate dictate her feelings or actions. As she drove home, she replayed the incident in her mind, analyzing every word, every glance. She wanted to make sure she remembered the details clearly, dates, times, the officer's exact words, because she knew that if she chose to act, she needed to be precise. When she arrived home, her husband was waiting. He had just returned from his first week as the new chief of police, still settling into his role and the responsibilities that came with it. Though she tried to greet him lightly, a small smile on her face, he immediately noticed something was wrong. There was a tension in her posture, a heaviness in her eyes that made him pause. "What happened?" he asked, his voice calm but concerned. She hesitated for a moment, trying to find the words, but she knew she could not sugarcoat the truth. She told him everything, the diner, the officer, the words, and the attitude. She described how he had singled her out, the way he had tried to intimidate her, and how she had stayed calm despite his aggression. As she spoke, she could see the shift in her husband's expression. First came surprise, then disbelief, and finally a steely determination. He had spent his career working with officers, understanding human behavior and leading teams. He knew that incidents like this could not be ignored. Her husband listened quietly, taking in every detail. He asked questions, not because he doubted her, but because he needed the full picture. Which diner? What time? Who else was there? Did anyone else see or record what happened? She answered everything patiently, grateful that he was not dismissive, not defensive, not blind to the pain she had endured. She could see that he understood both the personal and the professional weight of the situation. By the end of their conversation, they had a plan. Her husband would take the matter seriously, handling it through proper channels while ensuring that she felt supported and protected. He knew that his position as chief gave him responsibility, but he also knew he had to act with integrity. The goal was not just to punish the officer, but to make sure justice was done in a way that upheld the standards of the police department and restored confidence in the community. That evening, she could feel the tension slowly easing, replaced by a cautious sense of hope. She appreciated his calm approach, his insistence on following procedure while still showing personal care for her feelings. It was a delicate balance, but he handled it with the quiet confidence of someone who understood the importance of both justice and empathy. As they sat together over a simple dinner at home, she realized that even though the day had been difficult, she was not alone. She had an ally, a partner, and someone who would ensure that her voice mattered. Meanwhile, back at the diner, word of the incident had begun to circulate. One of the employees who had witnessed the confrontation quietly mentioned it to a few regular customers. Rumors spread, as they often do in small towns, but the story that reached her husband's office was accurate enough to take immediate action. It was a reminder that even small moments, small acts of courage and refusal to accept mistreatment could ripple outward, affecting others and setting the stage for change. The next morning, she received a call from her husband's office, informing her that the situation was being addressed. They had spoken with the diner staff and the patrons who had witnessed the encounter, gathering statements and evidence. The officer in question was being asked to explain his actions, and an internal review was underway. She felt a sense of relief, but also knew that the process could be slow and challenging. She was prepared to stand firm, knowing that the truth and her dignity were on her side. Over the next few days, she noticed a shift in how people treated her at the diner. Some smiled with quiet approval, while others approached her cautiously, offering words of support. It was a small but meaningful acknowledgement that she had stood up for herself, and that standing up for what was right could inspire others to do the same. She felt a quiet pride, not in confrontation itself, but in the courage it had taken to remain composed in the face of disrespect and prejudice. At home, the couple continued to strategize. Her husband outlined the steps he would take to ensure accountability while protecting the integrity of the department. He spoke of fairness, due process, and the importance of modeling the behavior expected from all officers. She listened, contributing her perspective as someone who had been directly affected. Together, they formed a plan that was both personal and professional, rooted in principles of justice and human dignity. As the investigation progressed, she realized that her life had subtly changed. She was more aware of her surroundings, more vigilant in her interactions, but also more confident. She no longer saw herself as vulnerable to unfair treatment. She saw herself as capable of responding thoughtfully and assertively when necessary. Each day brought small victories, whether it was a friendly nod from someone who had supported her or a small acknowledgement from coworkers that her story mattered. The officer, meanwhile, began to realize that his actions were not without consequences. Conversations behind closed doors, warnings, and meetings reminded him that behavior rooted in prejudice would not be tolerated. He had underestimated the strength and resolve of the woman he had confronted, and he had not anticipated the firm, but fair response of the chief. Slowly, the arrogance that had once defined his demeanor began to crack under scrutiny and accountability. Through it all, she continued her routine visits to the diner, though now with a sense of empowerment rather than simple comfort. Each time she walked through the door, she carried herself with confidence, knowing that she had faced a difficult moment and emerged with her dignity intact. Patrons and staff who had witnessed the original incident treated her with respect, and she became a subtle reminder to the community that courage, even in quiet, nonviolent forms, could affect real change. Evenings at home became a time of reflection and planning. She and her husband spoke openly about what had happened, what could happen next, and how to ensure that incidents like this were addressed constructively. Their conversations were not about anger or revenge, but about accountability, empathy, and the importance of leadership in creating safe spaces for all members of the community. These discussions deepened their bond, reinforcing the partnership that had been built on trust, respect, and shared values. In these moments, she understood something fundamental. Justice was not just about punishment. It was about recognition, understanding, and the creation of an environment where respect and fairness were expected, not optional. She saw that her experience, though painful, could serve as a catalyst for broader awareness and change. It was a lesson in resilience, a demonstration that standing firm with integrity could inspire others to reconsider their assumptions and behaviors. By the end of the week, the officer had been formally addressed by the chief, with appropriate actions taken to ensure accountability. The process had been transparent and fair, and she felt a sense of closure. While the encounter at the diner would always be a memory, it no longer carried the sting of helplessness or fear. Instead, it became a story of quiet strength, of partnership, and of the power of standing up for oneself in the face of injustice. As she sipped her coffee one morning, looking out the diner window, she reflected on the events of the past few days. She felt a sense of calm pride and quiet satisfaction. She had confronted adversity without losing her composure, and in doing so, she had reminded herself and her community of the importance of dignity, courage, and accountability. The world could be unfair, she realized, but responding with integrity and strength could create meaningful change, one small act at a time. Days passed since the diner incident, but the memory of it lingered in her mind. Each time she thought about the officer's words and tone, she felt a spark of frustration, but also a stronger sense of resolve. She realized that the situation was bigger than just one confrontation. It was about standing up for respect, fairness, and dignity, not only for herself but for everyone in the community who might face similar prejudice. She knew that doing nothing was not an option. Her husband, the new chief of police, had been balancing the responsibilities of his role with the need to handle this delicate matter. He knew the right way to act, both for the sake of justice and for maintaining trust within the department. They had been speaking frequently, planning each step carefully. She appreciated his methodical approach. While it could have been easy to let anger drive the response, he insisted on fairness, evidence, and accountability. This gave her confidence that the situation would be handled properly, but it did not make the wait any easier. That afternoon, she decided to return to the diner, not out of fearlessness, but to reclaim her space. She wanted to show herself and others that she would not be intimidated. Walking in, she felt the eyes of some patrons on her, some curious, some supportive. The waitress offered a small, encouraging smile, and she returned it, feeling a renewed sense of empowerment. The diner that had felt tense before now seemed ordinary again, a place where she could quietly assert her right to exist without harassment. She found her usual booth and sat down, opening her notebook to jot down thoughts and observations. Writing had always been her way to process difficult moments. Today, she wrote not only about the diner incident, but about the emotions it had stirred within her: anger, determination, resilience, and hope. She paused as she heard the door open and the familiar sound of the officer entering. Her heart skipped a beat, not out of fear, but in preparation for what was to come. She had already faced him once, and she was ready to stand her ground again if needed. The officer approached cautiously this time. He was aware that his previous behavior had been noticed and that the chief was aware as well. There was a shift in his demeanor, a mix of awkwardness and defensiveness. He attempted to speak, but she held up a hand, signaling that she wanted him to listen first. "I don't want conflict," she said calmly, her voice firm. "I only want to be treated with respect." She did not raise her voice, did not add anger or insult. Her calm authority made him pause. He muttered something under his breath, but she ignored it, refusing to give him the reaction he sought. Around them, the diner hummed with its usual background noise. A few regulars watched discreetly, sensing the tension but hoping the situation would not escalate. She noticed the slight quiver in the officer's posture, the uncertainty that had never been there before. For the first time, he realized that his arrogance and prejudice had consequences, and that they were visible to others. She decided to speak more directly, addressing not only the individual's behavior, but the broader message. "Everyone deserves to feel safe and respected here," she said, looking around the diner so that her words carried weight beyond just the two of them. "Actions like yours are not acceptable, and they have consequences. I hope you understand that." Her calm, measured approach was disarming. She did not accuse. She did not yell. She simply stated the truth, leaving little room for denial or evasion. The officer hesitated, glancing toward the waitress and the few patrons who had witnessed the original incident. He was confronted not by her alone, but by the reality of the community's awareness. This was a crucial moment. She realized that standing firm, calmly, was more powerful than any outburst or retaliation could have been. Her voice carried authority, not because of rank or power, but because of dignity, composure, and a refusal to be diminished. Finally, he stepped back, muttering something about following up later. She did not respond. She focused instead on her coffee and notebook, allowing herself a small, quiet satisfaction. The confrontation had not escalated into conflict, yet her message had been clear. She would not be bullied, and respect was non-negotiable. Around her, life in the diner returned to normal. Patrons resumed their meals, the chatter continued, but the subtle shift remained. Everyone who had witnessed this moment had seen the strength of calm courage. After leaving the diner that day, She felt a renewed sense of confidence. She knew that the officer's actions could not go unnoticed, and she was grateful that her husband, the chief, had the authority and integrity to ensure proper accountability. They met later that evening to review the next steps, discussing how the department would handle the officer's behavior while maintaining fairness and transparency. They spoke openly, her perspective valued as someone directly affected, his approach grounded in leadership principles. In the following days, small ripples of change became visible. Other officers who had observed the incident learned that such behavior would not be tolerated. Conversations were held, reminders given about professional conduct, and a culture of accountability began to take root. She saw the impact of her quiet courage, not as an isolated act, but as something that could influence behavior and expectations across the department and community. Her visits to the diner continued, now with an added layer of resolve. She was no longer simply reclaiming a personal space. She was setting an example. Patrons treated her with respect, some quietly offering words of support. She noticed subtle gestures, a nod, a smile, an acknowledgement that they had witnessed injustice met with strength. Each small interaction reinforced the idea that standing up for what is right, even in quiet ways, can have meaningful consequences. She also noticed the effect on herself. The experience, while initially painful, had strengthened her sense of self-worth and resilience. She realized that courage was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, persistent, and rooted in integrity. She could face the officer calmly, knowing that her strength came from dignity, composure, and an unwavering belief in justice. These qualities, she understood, would carry her through future challenges, both personal and professional. The officer, meanwhile, found himself navigating scrutiny he had never anticipated. Meetings with supervisors, reminders of professional standards, and the knowledge that his behavior was being monitored weighed heavily on him. He had underestimated the woman he confronted, and he had not anticipated the broader consequences of his arrogance. Slowly, he began to understand that respect is earned, not assumed, and that prejudice carries real consequences when confronted by courage and integrity. At home, she and her husband continued to discuss the incident and its aftermath. Their conversations were thoughtful, sometimes intense, but always grounded in mutual respect. They spoke about fairness, accountability, and the importance of creating a safe environment for everyone. She valued his guidance and perspective, while he valued her direct experience and insights. Together, they formed a partnership that was not only personal but professional, built on trust, understanding, and shared values. Through it all, she maintained her routines, her visits to the diner, her work, and her writing. She carried herself with quiet confidence, aware that she had faced a challenging situation and emerged with dignity and tact. Each day reinforced the lesson that courage is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a steady refusal to be intimidated, a calm insistence on fairness, and a commitment to one's principles. By the end of the week, the officer had been formally addressed by the chief, with appropriate measures taken to ensure accountability. The process was transparent, fair, and effective. She felt a sense of closure, though the experience had also left her more vigilant and aware of the realities of prejudice. She understood that standing up for oneself was not a single act, but an ongoing commitment to integrity, awareness, and courage. Walking into the diner one afternoon, she paused for a moment, observing the familiar surroundings. The smell of coffee, the hum of conversation, and the warm sunlight streaming through the windows reminded her that life continued, and that she had reclaimed her place in it. She felt pride not in confrontation itself, but in the strength it had taken to remain calm, composed, and resolute. She had faced injustice, and she had responded with dignity. That, she knew, was victory enough. The days following the confrontation at the diner were filled with a quiet tension. She knew that what had happened was not just a personal affront. It reflected deeper issues in the department and the community. But she also felt a growing sense of empowerment, a quiet assurance that the situation was being handled thoughtfully. Her husband, as the new chief, had already begun taking the necessary steps to ensure accountability, and she trusted him to do what was right. One morning, as she prepared for her day, her husband called her into his office. He had already gathered reports, spoken with witnesses, and reviewed surveillance footage from the diner. Everything had been documented carefully, leaving no room for doubt or misrepresentation. "We need to address this formally," he said, his tone calm but firm. She nodded, understanding that the next steps would be crucial not only for her, but for the entire community. Together, they went over the officer's record, noting past complaints and any prior incidents that could indicate a pattern of behavior. While it was disheartening to see, it also reinforced the need for immediate action. Her husband emphasized fairness and transparency, explaining that the officer would be given a chance to respond, but that the department would not tolerate prejudice or bullying. She appreciated his approach, seeing the balance between justice and professional procedure. The officer was called in for a formal meeting. She was not present in the room, but she knew the conversation would be serious. Her husband addressed the incident directly, outlining the complaint, reviewing evidence, and giving the officer an opportunity to explain himself. It was clear from the outset that there would be consequences. Her husband spoke calmly, but every word carried weight. He emphasized the department's values, the importance of respect for all members of the community, and the expectation that officers embody those principles at all times. Back at the diner, the community began to notice changes. The staff, who had witnessed the original incident, felt a sense of relief. Patrons who had observed the confrontation could see that accountability was possible and that injustice would not go unchallenged. The ripple effect of the situation was evident as conversations began to shift toward awareness and respect. People realized that standing up for oneself could inspire broader change, and that integrity mattered in both personal and public life. Meanwhile, she continued to process the experience. It was not easy to revisit the confrontation, even in her own mind. Memories of the officer's words and the fear she had initially felt returned at times, but they were tempered by the pride she felt in having remained composed and dignified. She realized that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. She had acted, and she had done so with integrity. Her husband's actions reinforced that lesson. By taking formal steps to address the officer's behavior, he demonstrated leadership that was firm, yet fair. He showed that accountability was not about personal vendetta, but about upholding standards and creating a culture of respect. She felt proud, not only for herself, but for the values he represented and the example he set for the entire department. The officer, now under scrutiny, began to understand the gravity of his actions. Meetings with supervisors, warnings, and discussions about professional conduct forced him to confront the consequences of his behavior. He could no longer dismiss the incident as a minor issue or an overreaction. The combined effect of her composure, the evidence, and the chief's firm yet fair approach made it clear that prejudice and bullying would not be tolerated. Over the following weeks, she noticed subtle but meaningful changes in the diner and the community. People treated each other with more awareness and respect. Conversations about behavior, fairness, and dignity became more common. Even small gestures, a nod of recognition, a word of support, reflected a growing understanding that everyone deserved respect. She realized that her personal experience had become a catalyst for broader awareness, that her courage had a ripple effect beyond the immediate confrontation. At home, she and her husband continued to discuss the ongoing situation. They spoke not only about the officer, but about leadership, fairness, and the responsibility that comes with authority. Their conversations were thoughtful and reflective, grounded in shared values and mutual respect. They explored questions of justice, ethics, and community responsibility, reinforcing the principles that guided their lives. These discussions strengthened their partnership, deepening their bond and clarifying their commitment to integrity. One evening, after another long day, she sat quietly in the living room, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. She thought about the fear she had initially felt, the tension in the diner and the officer's arrogance, and she thought about the calm, measured response she had maintained, the planning with her husband and the steps taken to ensure accountability. She realized that each element had contributed to the eventual resolution, and that courage and integrity had been her guiding forces throughout. The officer's formal reprimand became public knowledge within the department. While some were surprised by the decisive action, others recognized it as a necessary step to uphold standards and maintain public trust. The department reinforced its expectations for professional conduct, emphasizing respect, fairness, and accountability. She felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that her experience had helped set a precedent for how such incidents would be handled in the future. Her visits to the diner took on a renewed significance. Each time she walked in, she felt a sense of ownership, a reminder that she had reclaimed her space and her dignity. Patrons and staff acknowledged her with quiet respect, and she appreciated the subtle recognition. She had turned a moment of vulnerability into a demonstration of strength, showing that courage could manifest in calm, composed, and principled action. Through it all, she maintained her routines, her writing, and her personal reflections. She understood that life would always present challenges, and that prejudice and unfairness could arise in many forms. But she had learned that response mattered more than reaction, that integrity and dignity were powerful tools, and that standing up for oneself could inspire broader change. She carried these lessons forward not as a burden, but as a source of empowerment. In the end, the combination of her calm courage and her husband's leadership created a resolution that was both fair and meaningful. The officer faced consequences appropriate to his actions, and the department reaffirmed its commitment to professional conduct. The community, meanwhile, witnessed the importance of standing up for oneself and the power of accountability. She had faced adversity with strength, and in doing so had helped shape a culture of respect and fairness. One quiet afternoon, as she sat in the diner with her notebook, she reflected on the journey. What had begun as a painful and humiliating encounter had transformed into a story of empowerment, courage, and justice. She had not only defended her own dignity, but had contributed to a broader understanding of fairness and accountability in her community. She felt a sense of calm pride, knowing that she had acted with integrity and that her actions had mattered. The officer, now fully aware of the consequences of prejudice, began to adjust his behavior. It was a slow process, but the awareness was there, and the expectations had been clearly communicated. She did not seek revenge or harbor bitterness. She had only sought respect and fairness, and in achieving that, she had won something far more meaningful than a simple confrontation. She had demonstrated the power of courage, composure, and principled action.